Hello. Chapter 3 is about the three paradigms of knowing, a really, really important chapter. Sets up how we approach knowledge, assumptions that we make in gaining knowledge, and really, depending on what paradigm we're working from, will actually give us a methodological approach appropriate for our study. And so, paradigms are ways of viewing the world, how we actually think that knowledge is gained, and what the implications of that specific paradigm or that specific approach to knowledge generation, uh, what the implications are for what method we choose. So, really, really important chapter, a little bit dense, a little bit philosophical, but it sets up and answers some really important questions as we move forward. So, what I've done here is use two of the charts out of the chapter in an attempt to keep this succinct, short, and sweet, and to just clarify some of the important information from chapter 3. And I hope it helps. So, our first chart here defines the assumptions of epistemological paradigms. So basically, what we're saying here is, depending on what paradigm you are talking about, what are the assumptions that that paradigm makes about any number of things? So, for example, you can see the paradigms across the top: discovery, interpretation, and criticism. And then some of the assumptions down the left side: the nature of reality. So, how things are, what is reality like? The role of the knower or the researcher. You could think about the researcher as the knower. The role of contexts. So, how important is the situation in which a phenomena is observed or discussed, as far as is it objective? Does it matter? Um, does it impact the phenomenon being studied in a way that is substantial? Process characteristics mean the methodological characteristics. So, what sort of characteristics does the method that stems from this paradigm have? Purpose, what are we actually trying to do? And goal accomplishment, how do we know that we've actually accomplished our goal? So, what I'm going to do is actually go across each of the paradigms. So, for each of them, we'll talk about the nature of reality, role of knower, so on and so forth, so that you get a comparison and contrast. And I think that'll help clarify these things for you, and then you can kind of get a feel for, in combination with chapter 1 and the other parts of chapter 3, what the knowledge by discovery paradigm is really all about. So, as far as reality, in the discovery paradigm, we're saying that reality is objective and discoverable. So, science tends to fall in the discovery paradigm. And what we're basically saying here is that my reality and your reality are exactly the same. Whereas the interpretation and criticism paradigms, actually, we think that reality is socially constructed. And so the way that I experience the world around me socially constructs a reality, or it builds a reality for me that I then live in. Whereas the discovery paradigm folks say, you may experience reality differently than me, but we both are actually objectively experiencing the same thing. So there's not much room for personal experience as far as the nature of reality. In the knowledge or in the discovery paradigm, reality is reality. In the interpretation and criticism paradigm, reality is what we make of our experience. As far as the role of the knower or the role of the researcher, in the discovery paradigm, the knower or the researcher is detached. They're not really important to the process of gaining knowledge. Whereas in the interpretation paradigm, uh, the knower, the researcher is central. That actually the person doing the interpretation is actually generating the knowledge. And so you cannot separate the knowledge from the researcher or from the knower. And in the criticism paradigm, the same principle as the interpretation paradigm. But what we're basically saying is that a lot of factors, your life experience, your socioeconomic status, many demographic variables are actually impacting what reality is for you. And so you cannot separate not only your interpretation of your experience, as in the knowledge interpretation paradigm, but you cannot separate who you are in the world, demographic factors, experiential factors, from how you're going to interpret things. So, the role of the context in the discovery paradigm, context, much like the knower, is unimportant. In the knowledge by interpretation paradigm, context is subjective. Again, going back to this nature of reality being socially constructed, the context is completely and totally important if it's impacting how I am understanding and interpreting a phenomena in one context differs from another context, then that becomes extremely important to knowledge generated in the interpretation paradigm. Context in the criticism paradigm is much like the role of the knower, and that is, it is shaped by cultural and social realities, and so we cannot know things independent of our subject position in life. So, if I am a white male from the Anglo tradition, then the way that I know things, the way that I approach things, my filter, if you will, cannot be separated from my role in the world as a white male from the Anglo tradition. Process characteristics. The knowledge by discovery paradigm has very specific process characteristics, whereas the interpretation and criticism paradigm are not nearly as systematic as the knowledge by discovery paradigm. So what we're talking about in the knowledge by discovery paradigm is essentially, when you think about and learned about the scientific method, that's what's going on here. We want to be precise, make sure that we're accurate. When we say we're measuring height, we want to use an accurate measure of height. We want to be systematic, and that just means documenting the processes and procedures that we go through as we're trying to investigate something. And we want to be repetitive, meaning we want to be able to repeat our method and our findings over and over and over again. Knowledge by interpretation is a creative and value-laden process. And so what that basically means is I go through a process, I do some reflection, I think about how I'm actually interpreting that, what it means to me personally, and that's the process that I go through to gain knowledge in the interpretive paradigm. In the criticism paradigm, it's revealed, where we are going through or experiencing something, and we start to investigate what's going on, the structures that are behind the thing that we're experiencing. So if I am applying to college and I'm a minority and I get rejected, and my friends who are less qualified than I am get accepted, then I might try and do some investigation or some introspection and try and reveal some of the hidden power structures that are at play. Purpose, what we're trying to get done in the knowledge by discovery paradigm, is to describe or predict reality. We simply want to say, here's what's going on in a given aspect of reality. And so it may be that women talk more in public than men talk more in public than women talk more in private, men talk less in private, whatever the reality as we want to describe it. For the knowledge by interpretation, we want to understand how meaning is created or generated. So how am I coming about understanding things, or how is meaning being transmitted to me, or how am I sharing meaning with others? In the knowledge by criticism paradigm, what we're after is for people to be more aware of hidden power structures that are at play and oppression, and then an attempt to make social change. And finally, how do we know, or how do we accomplish the goals that we set out in our purpose? For the knowledge by discovery paradigm, it's about classifying things. So communication apprehension as high, medium, or low, generalizing from one population to another, and identifying laws. So if, for example, we said men talk more in public than women, and we knew that was true, that would be an axiom, as we talked about from chapter 1. In the knowledge by interpretation paradigm, we're really just trying to describe our personal experience. And so you can think about a journal as the goal accomplishment, maybe for the interpretation paradigm. The knowledge by criticism paradigm is more about advocacy. So I know that I've accomplished my goal if I see social change or if oppression is in some way, shape, or form lessened. And those are the assumptions of the epistemological paradigms, and I hope that that helps you. And finally, in chapter 3, a brief overview of some of the philosophical traditions associated with these epistemological paradigms that we talked about, the discovery, the interpretive, and the critical. There's a lot of stuff in that section of the chapter, and really I just want to hit some of the things that are a little bit more important than the rest of it. Certainly all of it's important, and if we were taking a communication theory class, we would spend a great deal of time talking about exactly what is in this section. But first, the discovery paradigm, which remember is the objective reality. We're measuring and trying to explain phenomena in the natural world, in the existing world, not in the psychological world. And so 3 elements there, 3 things there that we want to make sure and discuss are rationalism, empiricism, and positivism. So rationalism and empiricism kind of go together, and they are long-standing traditions. Rationalism is that we know things, or we can understand things, and we know that they are true if they satisfy logical testing and an objective reality. So what we're after here is that there is a discoverable reality out there, and that we are going to investigate it and hopefully come to a logical conclusion about it. Empiricism is a little bit different, and what we're basically saying there is that we can understand objective reality by observing it. And so empiricism is about observational research. And then positivism, which kind of guides most of scientific inquiry now, is comprised of 5 different characteristics, and we'll talk about those in just a second. But what we're basically saying is that observational and empirical processes are where we actually can get to reality, and we need to pay special attention to being objective as we're engaged in observation or empirical studies. And so they come up with kind of 5 different guiding behaviors so that precision is ensured. So the first one is falsification. And really we're not talking about saying that something is false, but a theory is falsifiable, meaning it can be tested. So it's not necessarily falsified, but testable is how you should think about that. Naturalism and realism kind of go hand in hand. We're talking about the physical world and the social world of interaction, and then an objective reality. So what we're saying with positivism is that we're interested in the objective reality that exists in the natural and interactive world. So the objective reality of science, the objective reality of communication studies. Transformational models, what we're saying here is that I may not be able to ever accurately find a way to measure how much you love your significant other, but I can observe things that people who are in love do. And if I observe you doing those things at a high rate, then I can actually be evaluating or measuring how much in love you are. So if I set out to measure how in love you are with your significant other, I might look for how much you hold hands. Do you hug? How much quality time do you spend together? What's your level of intimacy, so on and so forth, to try and get to an understanding of how in love with your significant other you are. So what I'm doing is measuring something indirectly through observing other things that support the thing that I'm trying to actually measure. And emergent objectivity discusses the same thing that we talked about in chapter 1 about the role of the researcher. So the researcher is not trying to push their own agenda onto the research. They are independent of the findings. And so that's the discovery paradigm. The interpretive paradigm, completely different sort of approach here. And what we're basically saying with symbolic interaction and constructivism is that interpretation is that discourse shapes our reality. So constructivism is basically saying that reality and meaning is all subjective and socially constructed. It's subjective to the person or people involved in the symbolic interaction, the communication, the language at play there. And so a lot more gray area in the interpretive paradigm. My version of reality, my version of events can be different than yours, but we can also agree on certain things. For example, beauty varies by culture. That's socially constructed within those cultures. Finally, the critical paradigm. Critical theory has a few central tenets to it. Basically, what we're saying here is that the goal of this theory is not to explain reality or come to some understanding of how meaning is constructed amongst parties or individuals, but we're trying to engage in social change. And so we do that by exposing hierarchical power structures that oppress certain groups at the expense of other groups. At the benefit of other groups. So, for example, in slavery, there was plenty of power structures, and this is certainly a blatantly obvious example, but certain power structures that benefited white folks that at the expense of black slaves. Now we might think about language, sexist language. I use the example of when we say doctor, we think of a male. When we say nurse, we think of a female. And so language would be the structure that we would try and expose as being oppressive in hopes of engaging in some sort of advocacy to change how language is deployed to make it more fair or less oppressive. So the goal of critical theory is to expose things, raise people's awareness of the harms of power structures, and then work for positive social change that lessens oppression and empowers all parties. And that ends chapter 3 about our paradigms, the discovery paradigm, the interpretive paradigm, and the critical paradigm. I hope that this little lecture clarifies things for you. If you have any questions, obviously, please feel free to let me know.